On national television, Pam Bondi attempted to undermine Jasmine Crockett with a single word: unqualified. But Crockett's reply didn't just silence the room, it shifted the entire tone of the discussion. Barely 10 minutes into the panel, the momentum changed. The event was the American Forum on Judicial Reform, broadcast live from the Lincoln Theater in Washington, D.C. The hall was full: senators, judges, community leaders, law students, and even a few celebrities were seated in the front rows. You could feel the unease even before anyone said a word. 5 panelists sat behind a white-draped table, but the attention, both literal and symbolic, was focused on 2 women in the center: Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, poised and experienced under bright lights, and Jasmine Crockett, a Democratic congresswoman from Texas, newer to the national spotlight, but known for her passionate delivery. The moderator was navigating a delicate discussion around the balance between states' rights and federal authority and police reform. Bondi spoke first, her tone smooth and rehearsed. "We need real experience to drive this conversation, not theatrical outrage. These are complex legal matters, not topics for slogans or social media posts." Crockett didn't react. She waited silently. When the moderator gestured to her, Bondi abruptly turned to her and said, clearly enough for microphones to catch, "Frankly, I don't think you're qualified to speak on this." That single statement shifted everything. The room didn't erupt. It paused. The kind of pause that carries tension. Crockett leaned slightly forward. Calm and clear, she asked, "What exactly makes me unqualified?" Her tone wasn't elevated. It was deliberate, controlled. Bondi paused before answering. "I've served as Attorney General. I've prosecuted major cases. I've been in decision-making rooms. This isn't a place for," she gestured vaguely, "emotional arguments." Crockett remained composed. "I've handled over 100 criminal cases as a public defender. I've drafted and passed legislation. I've worked across the aisle to push forward change. If experience only counts when it looks like yours, maybe that's the issue." The audience didn't applaud. They focused. Even the moderator stayed silent. Bondi's expression didn't change, but Crockett continued, steady as before. "I didn't show up for headlines. I brought evidence. I brought names. Mothers who call me at night because no one else listens. Children who are afraid of those meant to protect them." Bondi opened her mouth, but this time the moderator interrupted. "Let's stay on topic." But it was too late. The moment had begun, and Crockett had just begun her response. Someone in the audience whispered loud enough for the mic to catch, "She's on fire." A few quiet laughs followed. Crockett turned slightly to the audience, her expression serious. "When some people feel threatened, they dismiss others by calling them unqualified. It's not just disrespectful, it's misleading. I've seen this tactic before, and I'll see it again." She paused and locked eyes with Bondi. "Next time you call someone unqualified, check your facts first." The room didn't break out in applause, but the atmosphere had clearly shifted. The conversation had evolved. But to understand the depth of their disagreement, you'd have to go back to a time before the cameras, before the lights, before Crockett ever sat on a panel. In 2013, she was working behind a battered desk in a small Dallas office as a public defender. The halls of the courthouse echoed with noise and the smell of stale coffee. Her heels tapped along those corridors every weekday, often weekends too. She met with clients in small interview rooms, many of whom barely understood their charges, let alone how to fight them. Crockett rarely raised her voice, not because she lacked passion, but because precision made more impact. She didn't just argue, she analyzed. Judges noticed, prosecutors noticed, and although the system wasn't designed for someone like her to challenge it with expertise instead of influence, she kept doing just that. People began to take notice. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi was wrapping up her second term as Florida Attorney General. She was frequently featured on television, composed and authoritative. She opposed Obamacare. She supported strict sentencing laws. She was deeply rooted in the GOP's leadership circles, backed by endorsements and political connections. Her influence came with access. Crockett, by contrast, built her credibility from the ground up. No PR team, no regular media appearances, Just stacks of legal files and a memory that held onto the names of clients and injustices others forgot. But she didn't grow bitter. She stayed determined. She believed the law could still deliver fairness, if enough people inside the system were willing to fight for it. In 2019, she ran for the Texas House of Representatives. Most didn't expect her to succeed. She didn't resemble typical candidates, didn't speak like them either. But her campaign was authentic. It was built in neighborhood halls, churches, and local streets. She didn't promise change. She demanded it, and she won. Once elected, Jasmine Crockett didn't slow down. She continued pushing for reforms, criminal justice, bail policies, voting rights. She stood her ground, even when others hesitated. In committee meetings, some rolled their eyes when she entered. But when she spoke, the same people stopped dismissing her. What made Crockett stand out wasn't just her energy. It was how effectively she used it. During this time, Pam Bondi had shifted mostly to television. She appeared at political events, commentated at CPAC, and headlined fundraisers. She remained visible, but more from a distance. Her influence was still present, just not through legislative battles or courtroom arguments. And that was the contrast that stood out most. When Crockett and Bondi eventually sat side by side on that stage, they didn't just represent different political parties. They reflected fundamentally different worldviews. Bondi believed in preserving tradition, maintaining structure. Crockett believed reform required directly questioning the very systems that claimed to deliver justice. They had previously crossed paths in minor ways: public statements, televised interviews, and online debates, where their names were dropped with carefully chosen words. But the forum in Washington, D.C. was the first time they would speak face-to-face, unscripted, unrehearsed. Tensions like this rarely stay hidden for long, especially when deeper truths are bubbling underneath. It wasn't the first time Bondi had mentioned Crockett, but it was certainly the clearest. Months earlier, Crockett had appeared on MSNBC to discuss sentencing disparities. She made a point, measured, calm, about the role former prosecutors played in creating systems that reformers were now working to fix. She didn't mention Bondi by name. She didn't need to. The implication was evident. About a week later, Bondi addressed the topic on a conservative podcast with a modest but dedicated audience. She's loud. She's theatrical. I don't know if she's really after change or just chasing attention, Bondi said. There's a difference between being in front of a camera and doing the work. Crockett didn't respond. Not publicly, not online. But her silence wasn't indifference. It was calculated. She recognized Bondi's strategy. The comment was subtle enough to avoid broader scrutiny, but pointed enough to stir those who were listening closely. Throughout her career, Crockett had encountered this pattern. When she raised firm questions in Congress, she was labeled aggressive. When interrupted by others, she was told to remain civil. When she cited data and legal cases, she was accused of seeking attention. Meanwhile, less experienced men around her were praised for the same actions. Still, she stayed the course. There was one particular moment Crockett had never discussed publicly. It happened during a bipartisan dinner in Baltimore. Private, off-camera, aimed at building relationships. Bondi was there. So was Crockett. While seated over shrimp cocktails and small talk, Bondi made a comment just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. Some people think passion is a substitute for real experience, she said, eyes fixed on her wine glass. Crockett replied calmly, and some people think experience means they should never be challenged. I'm not that kind of Democrat. Bondi offered a tight smile and shifted the conversation, but everyone at the table remembered. Their clash wasn't rooted in personality, it was about principle. One saw reform as a disruption. The other saw it as essential. So when Crockett received an invitation to the national panel in D.C., she knew Bondi would also be there. Her staff asked whether she wanted to attend a different night, maybe avoid the situation. But Crockett didn't hesitate. No, she said, I want to sit right next to her. In the days before the event, media outlets speculated about a possible confrontation. Commentators debated whether Crockett could hold her ground, or if Bondi would use her background to take control. But Crockett wasn't preparing for a televised argument. She was preparing for clarity. She spent hours watching old clips of Bondi's speeches. She read legal filings. She reviewed news footage and public records, not to dig for dirt, but to prepare facts. If Bondi tried to discredit her, Crockett would respond with evidence, not emotion. She practiced replies with her team, short, direct, and fact-based. Her goal wasn't to trend online. It was to make the truth undeniable. Crockett had a feeling about how the panel would unfold, but preparation could only go so far. Nothing could replicate the intensity of a live exchange under studio lights. So, when Bondi used the word unqualified, Crockett didn't react immediately. She let the silence sink in. She let the room feel the weight of the insult. Then she leaned forward. "Pam," she began, not using titles, "you keep bringing up experience, so let's discuss it. Real experience." Her voice was calm. Her gaze never left Bondi. "You were Florida's Attorney General from 2011 to 2019, right?" Crockett asked, voice steady. "That means your office opposed early release programs for nonviolent offenders, many of them black men serving long sentences for minor marijuana charges." Bondi raised a hand slightly as if to interrupt, but Crockett didn't stop. "And during your tenure, Florida denied more than 60% of clemency applications. You led an office that maintained a system where mistakes, especially those made by young people, were punished without the chance for redemption." The room murmured. Crockett wasn't rushing. She was deliberate. "While that was happening," she continued, "I was in court every day defending those same individuals your policies affected. I stood next to a 17-year-old facing a life sentence over 2 grams of marijuana. I wasn't writing press releases. I was his last line of defense." Bondi's voice cut back in, louder and more defensive. "You're simplifying policy. Justice requires structure. These issues aren't as straightforward as you're presenting them." Crockett turned slightly, not toward Bondi, but to the audience. "That's the issue. It shouldn't be this complicated to treat people with fairness. But if your career was built on protecting gatekeepers, then maybe it makes sense." The moderator tensed in his seat, trying to gauge the moment, clearly uncertain if he should step in. Bondi leaned back, her face neutral, but her posture stiffened. "You think you're the only one with courtroom experience?" Bondi said, forcing a smile. "No," Crockett replied without delay, "but I'm one of the few who stood beside people who had no one else. I wasn't asking for convictions. I was fighting for second chances." That landed. The other panelists remained silent. Crockett adjusted her microphone, visibly relaxed. "I'm not unqualified," she said. "I'm inconvenient, because I won't repeat safe answers or ignore reality. I tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." From the back of the room, someone murmured, "Say that again." She didn't need to. The words were already resonating. Bondi turned to the moderator. "Are we turning this into a personal exchange?" Crockett didn't miss a beat. "This is personal. For every family broken apart by a justice system you call structured. For every teenager told that a plea deal was their only hope, even if they were innocent." She paused, then added, "You want to talk qualifications? Let's talk about the bills I've written. Reforms that reduce jail populations in my state. Let's talk about bipartisan efforts I helped build. Courtroom battles I fought without cameras or press. That's experience too. It just doesn't look like yours." A slow clap started from the back, then another. The moderator tried to bring the panel back. "Let's allow all speakers to finish without interruption." Crockett nodded and leaned back, calm and composed. Bondi flipped through her notes but didn't say a word. The room felt different now. The audience wasn't just listening. They were engaged, and Crockett still hadn't opened the folder she brought with her. She didn't believe in calling people out for the sake of it, but she did believe in responsibility. So when the moderator asked if any panelist had specific examples to share, Crockett didn't hesitate. "I do," she said. "Let's talk about track records." Bondi sat still, her hand resting on a folder. Crockett pulled a slim manila envelope from her stack. "No theatrics, just intent." "In 2014, she said, "your office submitted a brief arguing against same-sex marriage in Florida, stating it would harm societal values." Bondi's posture shifted. In 2015, Crockett continued, Florida didn't prosecute a single police officer in cases involving fatal use of force, including 3 involving unarmed black men. Bondi started, There were legal standards. I'm sure there were, Crockett said, cutting in softly. But the public saw what happened, and they remember who stayed silent. The moderator shifted in his seat, but Crockett was no longer addressing him. She was speaking directly to the room. In 2016, your campaign received a $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation. Days later, your office declined to join the lawsuit against Trump University. Now, the crowd reacted. Not just whispers, but gasps. Crockett kept her tone measured. I'm not saying Pam Bondi lacks intelligence, but when you dismiss others as unqualified while ignoring your own record, you're not protecting justice. You're protecting a system that serves the few. Bondi attempted a smile. I was elected. I led a state. Crockett didn't blink. So did I. And I didn't need wealthy donors or a national media platform. Just the people I serve. She paused, allowing the moment to breathe. And one more thing, she added, picking up her phone. Before you call someone performative, maybe don't appear on national television trying to spin statistics about prison reform. She held up her phone briefly. The screen displayed an article headline. Former Florida AG misrepresents crime statistics in Fox interview. Bondi's eyes narrowed. Her smile faded. The moderator cleared his throat. Let's keep this a discussion, not a trial. Crockett didn't look away from Bondi. I'm not trying to win a fight, she said. I'm reminding people that having credentials isn't the same as having credibility, especially when those credentials were used to keep the system unchallenged. Silence followed. One of the other panelists, a retired federal judge from Ypres, Arizona, finally spoke. She's right, he said, scanning the room. We've all seen policy used to silence people rather than protect them. I might not agree with everything she says, but I respect the work. It's real. That moment wasn't about agreement. It was about recognition. Jasmine Crockett looked down briefly, rearranged her notes, and then raised her head to address the audience again. I don't have to prove anything to anyone up here, she said, her voice firm but even. But I do owe the truth to the people watching. They deserve to know that experience isn't just about job titles. It's about time spent in the fight, not just observing from the sidelines. A few people nodded. Others remained still, clearly taking it in. Bondi stayed silent. The table, once comfortably hers, now felt unfamiliar. Crockett understood the moment wasn't about personal attacks. It was about perspective. And as the panel wrapped, the energy in the room didn't dissolve into applause. It shifted into movement, quick glances, murmured reactions, a few attendees already pulling out their phones. Jasmine Crockett didn't leave her seat immediately. She gathered her papers calmly, her demeanor professional and focused. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, rose quickly, flashing polite smiles and offering mechanical handshakes to fellow panelists. She avoided eye contact with Crockett. Outside the theater, a group had already formed near the press barricades. Reporters held microphones, podcasters streamed live on their phones, and students gathered, many of them hoping to hear more from the woman who had just changed the tone of the evening. Congresswoman Crockett, do you think Pam Bondi owes you an apology? Were you expecting her comments? Did you prepare for that kind of moment? Crockett didn't ignore the questions, but she didn't feed the hype either. I said what needed to be said, she replied, and I didn't say it for cameras. I said it for the people who are tired of watching power protect itself. The clip from the panel made its way to Instagram within minutes. On TikTok, it hit 500,000 views before midnight. On Twitter, now called X, it trended. In under 2 hours under hashtags like Prior Crockett Clapback, Geo receipts delivered and qualified and ready. Even CNN replayed the exchange, twice. But the conversation didn't stay in D.C., it spread into classrooms, group chats, barbershops, panel discussions. Everyone had an opinion. Some conservative voices called Crockett disrespectful. Others quietly admitted Bondi didn't handle the situation well. A few tried to paint the moment as a display of leftist outrage, But the video didn't support that narrative. Crockett had been calm. She hadn't raised her voice. She had laid out her case and let the facts stand on their own. That's what resonated. And especially for many young women, particularly young black women, the moment felt deeply personal. A college student in Kansas posted a tearful reaction. "Dio, she didn't let them silence her," she said. "She didn't fold. That's what I needed to see today." A high school teacher in Ohio printed Crockett's quotes and taped them to her classroom wall. Even a retired judge in California, who didn't align with Crockett politically, wrote a blog post praising her for staying grounded. She didn't use emotion to overwhelm, he wrote. She used facts. She demonstrated discipline. That's what leadership looks like. Through it all, Crockett stayed quiet. She didn't go on a media tour. She didn't claim a win. She flew back to Texas, returned to her schedule, and let the moment breathe. Her staff received over 3,000 emails in 2 days. Many came from people who said they'd never watched a political panel before but couldn't look away once she started speaking. They weren't drawn in by theatrics. They were drawn by someone who didn't flinch. Bondi, on the other hand, avoided the press for a week. When she finally responded, it was with a brief written statement. "I respect all voices in this debate, even those I may disagree with. My focus remains on constructive solutions." There was no reference to her original remark, no acknowledgement of the facts Crockett had presented. But by then, the conversation had moved on. For Crockett, it had never been about headlines. It had always been about something deeper. And now, she was ready to explain it in her own words. 3 days after the panel, she stood behind a wooden podium at a community center in Fort Worth. No cameras, no stage lighting. Just a crowded room filled with folding chairs, the smell of strong coffee and layers of winter coats. The audience was made up of everyday people, teachers, barbers, students, retired nurses. Some wore suits, others wore hoodies and sneakers. But what they all shared was a familiar look, the look of people who had seen what happened and understood what it meant. Crockett didn't start with a thank you. She started with a question. "How many of you have ever been underestimated?" Hands shot up immediately. A few people laughed in recognition. She smiled, but just a little. "Me too," she said. "And that doesn't stop just because you win an election or wear a microphone. People still question how you got there. They'll still try to ignore the road you walked to earn your place." A woman near the front called out, "Tell it." Crockett didn't raise her voice. She leaned in slightly and kept going. "When Pam Bondi said I wasn't qualified, she wasn't just talking to me. She was talking to every young person with big ideas and no famous name. Every public defender who chose a smaller paycheck to help people no one else would represent. Every one of us who's had to work twice as hard for half the credit." The room fell into a deep, respectful quiet, not out of shock, but shared understanding. "I don't need to be everyone's favorite," Crockett said, scanning the room. "But I do need to be honest. I'll keep asking questions others avoid, especially in places where those questions are usually ignored. And if that makes me convenient, I can live with that." People nodded. Some murmured in agreement. Others stayed quiet, but their expressions said enough. Then Crockett shared something personal. "When I was in college," she said, "a professor told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously in law. He said maybe I should consider public relations instead." There were gasps, a few groans. She paused, then added, "I thanked him. And then I made the dean's list for 4 semesters straight." The crowd laughed and applauded, not out of politeness, but because the moment struck a chord. She continued, anchoring the message. "I'm not here to tear anyone down, but I won't allow rooms to remain one-sided. Because when people like Pam Bondi get to define who is qualified, they end up closing the door on entire generations of voices." From the back of the room, a woman stood up and asked, "What do you tell young girls when someone tells them to stay in their place?" Crockett answered without hesitation, "I tell them to create their own place, and speak so clearly that nobody can pretend not to hear them." Applause started again, stronger this time. It filled the room. Crockett let it happen for a few seconds, then raised her hand gently. The room settled. "This wasn't about winning a debate," she said. "It was about showing what credibility looks like. It means listening. It means doing the work. And it means staying grounded, even when the lights are off. Later that night, video clips from the Fort Worth speech started making rounds online, mostly shared by everyday people, not political influencers. These were folks who didn't follow politics closely, but who connected deeply with what she had said. And while those clips circulated, Crockett took a moment for herself. The next morning, she sat alone in her office, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that read, "Defend, don't pretend." Her phone buzzed constantly, missed calls, texts, media requests, but she kept it on silent. She wasn't avoiding the attention. She was simply taking a pause. Some moments don't need microphones. They need reflection. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the wall across from her desk. 3 items were framed there: her law degree, a photo of her swearing into Congress, and a handwritten letter from a former client, a 19-year-old she had defended in a felony gun charge 3 years earlier. That letter meant more than the other 2 combined. In it, the young man had written, "You believed in me when I couldn't explain what happened. When nobody else listened, you did. That saved me." Crockett read that line again. It reminded her why she never tried to mimic anyone else, why she never tailored her tone to fit in with the political elite. Each time she walked into a hearing, a panel, or a committee room, she brought with her the voices of people who never got invitations to speak, people who rarely got the benefit of the doubt. Her mind drifted back to that night, the panel, the crowd, the exchange, the silence between each of her responses. The moment everything turned, all those years representing people in court had prepared her for that night, better than any debate prep ever could. Not because she was chasing conflict, but because she understood the weight of standing up for people who couldn't do it alone. She stood up and cracked her office window. Street sounds filtered in. Car horns, a barking dog, someone yelling about a lost phone. Life was still moving. She liked that. A knock came at her door. Her assistant poked her head in. "Hey, just checking. CNN, NPR, and 2 big podcasts. Want interviews. Should I set them up?" Crockett didn't even turn around right away. "Tell them I'm good for now." "Really? Not even NPR?" She smiled. "If I keep talking too much, people stop listening. Sometimes silence says more." The assistant nodded and closed the door. Crockett sat back at her desk and pulled out a legal pad. She began outlining ideas for her next community event. Not a press conference, not a TV appearance, just another town hall. A place where real questions would be asked and real answers expected. Midway through writing, she stopped and scribbled a new note at the top of the page. "Let your truth be so clear they have to lie to fight you." That was the principle she carried with her, not about ego, or volume, or visibility, but about accuracy, accountability, and trust. She knew something important. People don't forget the moments when they feel seen, and during that panel, in that theater, millions of people saw her, not just standing up for herself, but for everyone who had been underestimated, ignored, or silenced long before they ever had a chance to speak. She smiled to herself, just a little. "I don't need to be everyone's favorite," Crockett said, scanning the room. "But I do need to be honest. I'll keep asking questions others avoid, especially in places where those questions are usually ignored. And if that makes me convenient, I can live with that." People nodded. Some murmured in agreement. Others stayed quiet, but their expressions said enough. Then Crockett shared something personal. "When I was in college," she said, "a professor told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously in law. He said maybe I should consider public relations instead." There were gasps, a few groans. She paused, then added, "I thanked him. And then I made the dean's list for 4 semesters straight." The crowd laughed and applauded, not out of politeness, but because the moment struck a chord. She continued, anchoring the message. "I'm not here to tear anyone down, but I won't allow rooms to remain one-sided. Because when people like Pam Bondi get to define who is qualified, they end up closing the door on entire generations of voices." From the back of the room, a woman stood up and asked, "What do you tell young girls when someone tells them to stay in their place?" Crockett answered without hesitation, "I tell them to create their own place, and speak so clearly that nobody can pretend not to hear them." Applause started again, stronger this time. It filled the room. Crockett let it happen for a few seconds, then raised her hand gently. The room settled. This wasn't about winning a debate, she said. It was about showing what credibility looks like. It means listening. It means doing the work. And it means staying grounded, even when the lights are off. Later that night, video clips from the Fort Worth speech started making rounds online. Mostly shared by everyday people, not political influencers. These were folks who didn't follow politics closely, but who connected deeply with what she had said. And while those clips circulated, Crockett took a moment for herself. The next morning, she sat alone in her office, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that read, "Defend, don't pretend." Her phone buzzed constantly, missed calls, texts, media requests, but she kept it on silent. She wasn't avoiding the attention. She was simply taking a pause. Some moments don't need microphones. They need reflection. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the wall across from her desk. 3 items were framed there: her law degree, a photo of her swearing into Congress, and a handwritten letter from a former client, a 19-year-old she had defended in a felony gun charge 3 years earlier. That letter meant more than the other 2 combined. In it, the young man had written, "You believed in me when I couldn't explain what happened. When nobody else listened, you did. That saved me." Crockett read that line again. It reminded her why she never tried to mimic anyone else, why she never tailored her tone to fit in with the political elite. Each time she walked into a hearing, a panel, or a committee room, she brought with her the voices of people who never got invitations to speak, people who rarely got the benefit of the doubt. Her mind drifted back to that night, the panel, the crowd, the exchange, the silence between each of her responses. The moment everything turned, all those years representing people in court had prepared her for that night, better than any debate prep ever could. Not because she was chasing conflict, but because she understood the weight of standing up for people who couldn't do it alone. She stood up and cracked her office window. Street sounds filtered in. Car horns, a barking dog, someone yelling about a lost phone. Life was still moving. She liked that. A knock came at her door. Her assistant poked her head in. "Hey, just checking. CNN, NPR, and 2 big podcasts. Want interviews. Should I set them up?" Crockett didn't even turn around right away. "Tell them I'm good for now." "Really? Not even NPR?" She smiled. "If I keep talking too much, people stop listening. Sometimes silence says more." The assistant nodded and closed the door. Crockett sat back at her desk and pulled out a legal pad. She began outlining ideas for her next community event. Not a press conference, not a TV appearance, just another town hall. A place where real questions would be asked and real answers expected. Midway through writing, she stopped and scribbled a new note at the top of the page. "Let your truth be so clear they have to lie to fight you." That was the principle she carried with her, not about ego or volume or visibility, but about accuracy, accountability, and trust. She knew something important. People don't forget the moments when they feel seen, and during that panel, in that theater, millions of people saw her, not just standing up for herself, but for everyone who had been underestimated, ignored, or silenced long before they ever had a chance to speak. She smiled to herself, just a little. In the days following the high school visit, the momentum didn't slow. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's speech in Fort Worth continued to circulate, not just in political circles, but in everyday spaces. Hair salons, classrooms, text threads, between friends. What stood out wasn't just what she had said, it was how she said it. No shouting, no dramatics, just a steady, precise delivery of facts, and a deep understanding of what was at stake. People weren't just reacting to a political moment, they were reacting to something personal, to the feeling of being talked over, to the experience of constantly proving yourself, to the frustration of watching systems protect those in power while demanding perfection from everyone else. A woman in Atlanta tweeted, "She didn't just clap back. She calmly reminded them why she was in the room to begin with." In Los Angeles, a youth group used her speech as part of a discussion about advocacy and representation. In Detroit, a community college professor asked her students to write reflections on the phrase, You stop waiting for their permission to be excellent. And all the while, Crockett remained consistent. She didn't pivot to a victory tour. She kept showing up to committee meetings. She kept pushing legislation. She kept answering calls from constituents. Because for her, that night on the panel wasn't a turning point. It was a reflection of everything she'd already been doing, and everything she intended to keep doing. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi stayed mostly quiet. After the brief written statement, she avoided interviews. Her usual TV spots were postponed. A few conservative commentators tried to defend her, suggesting Crockett had taken things too far or made it personal. But the footage told a different story, one where the tone remained professional and the facts were laid out plainly. Even viewers who didn't fully agree with Crockett's politics admitted Bondi had been unprepared for the response. One right-leaning columnist wrote, "It wasn't the argument that shifted the room, it was the evidence. And Crockett hadn't even used all the material she brought with her. She still had notes, court rulings, policy briefs, voting records. She hadn't needed them. She had spoken from memory, from lived experience, from years of standing in rooms where she wasn't expected to speak with authority. Her goal wasn't to dismantle a person. It was to challenge a pattern where credentials were used to dismiss, where tone was weaponized to control the conversation, where qualified became a moving target, one that always seemed to shift when women like her stepped forward. In an interview weeks later, not one she sought out, but one she agreed to at a local town hall, she explained it clearly. "I don't want to argue about who deserves to be heard. I want to shift the conversation to who's actually doing the work," she said. The audience clapped, not loudly, but intentionally. It wasn't applause for entertainment. It was recognition. She went on. "When someone tells you you're unqualified, you have choices. You can get angry. You can stay quiet. Or you can respond with proof of what you've done, of who you've helped, of why your voice matters. And then you let the facts carry the rest." That message continued to ripple, quietly but steadily. It wasn't loud. It was lasting. And the truth was, Crockett didn't need to dominate a news cycle. She didn't need constant retweets or primetime commentary. What she needed, and what she was steadily building, was trust. Trust from the people who had seen their own struggles in her words. Trust from communities who had grown used to being overlooked. Trust from those who had never heard someone speak to them, not just for them. She became, for many, a reminder that strength isn't always loud, and truth isn't always wrapped in a headline. Her law background had prepared her for that moment. But her lived experience gave her the reason to step into it. And as the clip continued to circulate, one phrase kept coming back. On t-shirts, in captions, on handwritten posters taped to dorm room walls. "Let your truth be so clear they have to lie to fight you." That line had started as a scribble on her legal pad. Now it had become something bigger, a kind of quiet rallying cry, and Crockett wasn't trying to lead a movement. She was just doing the work, showing up, speaking, plainly, making sure the next time someone like her sat at a panel they wouldn't be dismissed so easily. Because if the moment had taught anyone anything, it was this: being underestimated is not the same as being unprepared, and being unqualified isn't a label. It's often a strategy used by those trying to protect systems that are long overdue for questioning. Jasmine Crockett never needed to say she won that panel. She didn't have to. The moment had already made its mark, not through trending clips or applause, but through impact. In Washington, the forum had ended. The lights dimmed. The room cleared, but the weight of the exchange lingered. What began as a single insult had opened up a larger, overdue conversation. One that wasn't really about titles or resumes, but about who gets to define value in public spaces. Back in Texas, Crockett's work continued. Her team kept moving, handling legislative schedules, responding to constituents and organizing outreach events. But there was a noticeable shift. More people were showing up. More questions were being asked. More young leaders were reaching out, not for advice, but to say, "I saw what you did." At one such event, a teenage girl waited quietly after a round table to speak with Crockett. She didn't have a question. She just said, "Thank you for not backing down." Crockett nodded. You don't have to yell to be heard. You just have to be ready when it's your turn. That became a theme in her private reflections. Readiness. Because the truth was, no one gives you the perfect moment. And if you wait to be invited into the conversation, you'll wait forever. She thought about the word Bondi had used. Unqualified. How quickly it was said. How casually. And how deeply it struck a chord with so many people watching. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about the idea that credentials alone should be enough to silence lived experience. In a short column she later published online, not through a major outlet, but on her district website, she wrote, I didn't speak up to make headlines. I spoke up because silence would have told people they were right to overlook me. And I've never believed that truth should be quiet, just because it makes someone else uncomfortable. The post wasn't widely shared. It wasn't meant to be. But those who read it found something grounding in its simplicity. And that's what defined Crockett's approach moving forward. Not bigger platforms, not louder messaging, just consistent fact-driven presence. She kept bringing attention back to the work, to legislation, to community conversations, to the slow, necessary business of reform. Even months after the panel. When people brought it up, she would smile politely, nod and redirect. What part of the policy stood out to you? She'd ask. Let's talk about what we can fix. She wasn't interested in building her name off a viral moment. She was interested in making sure moments like that actually led to something. As for Pam Bondi, her schedule eventually resumed. She returned to television segments and panel discussions, though with noticeably more caution. The phrase, unqualified, didn't resurface. The dynamic had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to remind everyone watching that challenges to power, when backed by preparation and clarity, don't need to be repeated to be remembered. And so, the story settled, not into closure, but into continuity. In a quiet office, on a regular afternoon, Jasmine Crockett was found doing what she always did, reviewing policy drafts, preparing for committee hearings, answering emails from people who didn't know the right political language, but knew they needed someone to listen. On the wall, the letter from her former client remained in its frame. The coffee mug, still chipped, was by her side. She didn't need reminders of what happened on that stage, but sometimes, when she passed by a community center or walked through a high school hallway, someone would stop her, not to discuss politics, but to say something simple like, I saw you speak. And each time she'd respond with the same, few words, I'm glad it meant something. That's why I said it. Because for her, it was never about scoring points. It was about making space for truth, for evidence, for people whose stories deserved better than to be dismissed by a single word. That panel had been a moment, but the message, clear, steady, and rooted in lived truth, would continue long, after the cameras stopped rolling. And so, if you take anything from her story, let it be this. You don't have to come from power to challenge it. You don't need permission to speak clearly, and when someone tries to reduce you with a label, answer with the record, not with noise, with proof.